To you all. Today we are doing film genres part 4. The other genres of movies. Today let us begin with the horror film. Horror film which has its origin in the Gothic novel depicts the disturbing and dark subject matter in order to evoke emotions like fear, terror, disgust, shock and suspense in the audience. See, when we examine horror films, we can see that horror films of course has its origin in the Gothic novel. Gothic novel, the dark novel with the ambience of dark and frightening elements. Gothic novel, you have studied Gothic novel. From the Gothic novel came or emerged a horror film, and horror film depicts the mentally disturbing and dark subject matter. Like the Gothic novel, Gothic film also depicts or shows or reveals dark subject matter. What is the aim of the Gothic novel as well as the horror film? To evoke emotions like fear, terror, disgust. When we see some splatter films in which the body is shown in the mutilated form or in the degenerated form, we are getting a sense of disgust and shock and suspense in the audience. So this is the aim of horror films. Horror film which has its origin in the Gothic novel depicts the disturbing and dark subject matter in order to evoke emotions like fear, terror, disgust, shock and suspense in the audience. The broad term horror film encompasses or includes or comprises or consists of large and wide-ranging hybrid variants. The broad term horror film encompasses or includes large and wide-ranging hybrid variants. ഈ ഹൊറർ ഫിലിം എന്ന് പറയുന്ന വിശാലമായ ടേമിൽ ഉൾപ്പെടുത്തിയിരിക്കുന്നത് വളരെ വിപുലമായ വിശാലമായ മിക്സഡ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള വേരിയൻസ് വിഭാഗങ്ങളാണ്. ഇൻക്ലൂഡിങ് സിന്ധി ഹൊറർ ഫിലിംസ്, ദർ ആർ ഗോത്തിക് ഹൊറർ വിജനമായ ഒരു കുന്നിനും പ്രദേശം, അവിടെ സൈക്കോയിലൊക്കെ കാണിക്കുന്ന ആ സൈക്കോയുടെ ബംഗ്ലാവ് പോലുള്ള വിജനമായ കുന്നിനും പ്രദേശം, അവിടെ വളരെയധികം ദുരൂഹതയുള്ള കുറേ ഭൃത്യന്മാർ, അങ്ങനെ കാണിക്കുന്ന ഡാർക്ക് ഡിസ്ഗസ്റ്റിംഗ് ഗോത്തിക് ഹൊറർ ആൻഡ് splatter films are the films in which human bodies are shown in a disgusting way in the mutilated form or with wounds and pusses, or the head in one way and the limbs are in other way spreading around, and degenerated bodies are shown. That is splatter films. And slasher films are the films in which murder scenes are lavishly depicted. Slasher films, splatter subgenre that deliberately portrays gore and graphic violence. Clear-cut disgusting violence is shown and gore is shown in slasher films. It is a subgenre or horror films. And slasher films, it is a subgenre of horror film. In it, the killer murders a group of people, usually using bladed tools. Usually, the murderers or the killer uses bladed tools with sharp blades. So cruelly, without any mercilessly, the killer or the murderer murders innocent people in slasher films. Then there are monster movies, King Kong, Frankenstein, and such films are there, monster movies. psychological horror films like Psycho and so many other films in every language we can see such psychological horror films which appeal to us very greatly. Comedy horror, the films like in Ghost House, comedy horror. Then post-modern horror. So these are the different variants of horror films. Which are the different variants of horror films? There are gothic horror, splatter films, slasher films, monster movies in which monsters are the frightening characters, psychological horror, black horror, post-modern horror, etc. The early examples of horror films include, when we trace the history of horror films, we should necessarily notice the French filmmaker Georges Méliès, The Bewitched Inn, which was brought out in the early, it is a silent film. The Bewitched Inn is a silent film which was brought out in the year 1897, in the very early period of filmmaking. Georges Méliès film, The Bewitched Inn, came out. It can be said to be the first horror film. Then the Apparition means monsters, apparition, which came out in the year 1903. So these are the early horror films we can see when we examine the history of horror films. The American Edison companies, Frankenstein, a typical monster character, Frankenstein, which came out in the year 1910. It is also a horror film. And The Student of Prague. So it is a German film, The Student of Prague. It came out in the year 1913, German film. And it was remade later. This film was remade later. Then the movements like German Expressionism and Surrealism have influence in the development of horror films. Of course, the film movements like German Expressionism and Surrealism have deep impact or deep influence in the development of horror films. Then a cycle of popular Hollywood monster movies. Now we are examining monster movies a little bit. The cycle of means the movies made, then it is remade with slight changes. There is a cycle of popular Hollywood monster movies such as Phantom of Opera, a horror film, Hollywood horror film. The Phantom of Opera, directed by Rupert Julian, in the year 1925, it came out. It was released in the year 1925. It was popular in the US in the mid 1920s. It was highly popular. The people liked the film very much. The monster movie Phantom of Opera was liked by, it was a popular film. It was liked by people around in US in the mid 1920s. Then comes Bram Stoker's story Dracula. In 1931. The first Dracula came out later. There are various remakings of this film, Dracula. Even in Malayalam there was Dracula directed by Vinayan. It was a different kind of Dracula. See, Dracula film, the first film production was in the year 1931 by Todd Browning. The filmmaker was Todd Browning, T-O-D-D, Browning, B-R-O-W-N-I-N-G, Dracula. Then comes another Frankenstein. That is why it is a cycle. Another Frankenstein, directed by James Whale in 1930. Then the Mummy. Mummy has various remakings, various films, various series. Mummy is of course a series of horror films. The first Mummy was directed by Carl Freund. Carl Freund, the first Mummy. Yeah, it came out in the year 1938. It was released in the year 1938. The first Mummy. Then Freaks again by Todd Browning. Todd Browning, you know, the director of the famous Dracula, the horror film Dracula. His another horror film was Freaks, Freaks, Freaks. It was released in the year 1933. So these were some of the films that established the term horror film in the critical usage. So these were some of the films which established the title horror films. It established the term or the title horror films in the critical use. The film critics used horror film to this genre of films. So these films established the term horror films in the critical usage. The movies of this genre exploit a widespread fascination with the supernatural monsters. So in our unconscious minds, from our childhood onwards, there is a wild, mad, fantastic fascination for supernatural elements, unearthly beings or unearthly elements like ghosts, monsters, phantoms, fairies, etc. So we have a great fascination for these unearthly beings or supernatural elements. You and I have, or you and I had these feelings from our childhood onwards. So this is something which these filmmakers tried to exploit from the audience. So this feeling was exploited by the filmmakers. See, we can say that the movies of this genre exhibit a widespread fascination with the supernatural monsters, bodily transformation like the scientific fiction films, Terminator, etc., Spider-Man, Terminator, etc. You might have seen these popular films. Bodily transformation and fear of the other. We fear something. We have the fear of something. So the fear is an emotion which gives a kind of entertainment to us. Or we can say fear is a pleasurable experience. After getting a shock, we feel very much pleased. That is our psychological attitude. After getting frightened, we have a sense of entertainment or amusement. That is the common attitude of the people like ourselves. So, the movies of this genre exhibit a widespread fascination of the supernatural monsters, bodily transformations, which we can see in splatter films, fear of the other and death, fear of death. The filmmaking practices involve the technique of, the filmmaking practices include these, when we see the technical side of these films, so many technical effects help the making of these horror films. One of them is chiaroscuro or low lighting or lights with shadow. Lighting with the shadow, low lighting. We have studied chiaroscuro. Please try to remember these things. Please study everything well. Everything should be in your memory always. Because it is the first time that you are getting an opportunity to learn film studies in detail. Even though you have started from your high school onwards, it is the first time in your life you are studying everything elaborately. So study well. Sometimes you may not get an opportunity to learn these things again in your lives. So, the filmmaking practices involve the techniques of chiaroscuro lighting, low candid camera angles, the low candid, distorted കാൻഡഡ് ക്യാമറ ആംഗിൾസ്. നമ്മളെ ഭീതിപ്പെടുത്താൻ വേണ്ടി ക്യാമറ ഫ്രെയിമൊക്കെ ഇങ്ങനെ തിരിച്ചും മറിച്ചുമൊക്കെ കാണിക്കുന്ന രീതിയിലുള്ള ക്യാമറ ആംഗിൾസ്, അതുപോലെ കിയാറസ്ക്യൂറോ എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഈ ഷാഡോസുള്ള വ്യക്തമായി കാണിക്കാത്ത, ഒരു രൂപം വ്യക്തമായി കാണിക്കാത്ത രീതിയിലുള്ള ലൈറ്റിങ് നമ്മൾ എസ്ര പോലുള്ള ഫിലിംസിൽ കണ്ടിട്ടുണ്ട്. മലയാളത്തിലെ തന്നെ ആദ്യത്തെ ഹൊറർ ഫിലിം എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ഒരു പക്ഷേ 1964 റിലീസ് ചെയ്ത ഭാർഗവി നിലയമായിരുന്നു. അതിനുശേഷം എത്ര ഫിലിംസ്, ലിസ, പിന്നെ വിനയൻ്റെ ആകാശദൂത്, വെള്ളി നക്ഷത്രം, ആകാശദൂത് പാർട്ട് 2, പിന്നെ വി ക്യാൻ സേ മണിച്ചിത്രത്താഴ്. ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് ഓൾസോ എ ഹൊറർ ഫിലിം ഇൻ വൺ സെൻസ്. ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് എ മിക്സ്ചർ ഓഫ് so many elements, so many sub-genres are there in the film Manichitrathazhu. It is also a fantasy film, we can say. Many things put it into it. And in Tamil there is Kanchana film. There are Telugu films. There was one Telugu films in which Anushka was the protagonist. So many films are there. So we actually love watching in order to get frightened. We have a great pleasure for being frightened. We want to get frightened and seek a pleasure from that fear. That is something which lies the inmost recesses of our mind. So we have the fear of the other, fear of the death. The filmmaking practices involve the techniques of chiaroscuro lighting, low candid camera angles, distorted images will be distorted. ഒരു വേലക്കാരി ഇങ്ങനെ റാന്തലായിട്ട് വരുന്നു, ആ മുഖം ഇങ്ങനെ ഭീകരമായി കാണിക്കും. നമ്മൾ വിചാരിക്കും എവിടെയാണ് കുഴപ്പക്കാരി, എവിടെയാണ് പ്രേതബാധയുള്ളതെന്ന് കരുതുന്നു. അപ്പം അങ്ങനെ നമ്മൾ വിചാരിക്കുന്നു. ഡിസ്റ്റോർട്ടഡ് ഇമേജസ് ആൻഡ് restricted point of view is restricted to certain images or certain persons, which is shown in chiaroscuro lighting, in low lighting. And also the supernatural horror tradition in the classic cinema of East Asia and Japan holds a testimony or a witness to the fact that this is truly an international genre. Horror film is an international genre. It is a genre with almost all countries. The great testimony is the early movies of East Asia and Japan. The supernatural horror tradition in the classic movies of East Asia and Japan. Japan holds a testimony to the fact that this is truly international genre. എല്ലാ രാജ്യങ്ങളിലും കാണുന്ന അന്തർദേശീയമായ ഒരു വിഭാഗമാണ് ഈ ഹൊറർ ഫിലിം എന്നുള്ളതിന് ഏറ്റവും നല്ല തെളിവാണ് ആദ്യകാലത്ത് തന്നെ ജപ്പാനിലും ഈസ്റ്റ് ഏഷ്യയിലും തന്നെ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്ന ഈ ഹൊറർ ഫിലിംസ്. ദി 1960 ഫിലിം സൈക്കോ. വെൻ വി മെൻഷൻ ഹൊറർ ഫിലിംസ് ഓർ psychological thriller, this name we can never forget. The 1960 film Psycho. It is succeeded in the film Psycho succeeded. It became a tremendous success in terrifying the audience and relocating horror to a contemporary setting. It relocated. The Psycho film relocated horror to a contemporary setting. In a contemporary setting of a motel and also a Gothic bungalow, Gothic house. So, the 1960 film Psycho succeeded in terrifying the audience, frightening the audience, and relocating horror to a contemporary setting. The film relocated horror to a contemporary setting. സാധാരണ ഒരു സെറ്റിങ്ങിൽ ഈ ഹൊററിൻ്റെ എലിമെൻറ്റ് ചേർത്തു എന്നുള്ളതാണ് ഇതിന് ഏറ്റവും വലിയ പ്രത്യേകത. This kind of filmmaking was emulated by so many filmmakers in Hollywood and in other parts of the world. And you know, by the year 1960s, the horror film became an important genre in Italy also. When we examine the history of Italian films, we can see that by the year 1960, the horror film became an important, significant genre in Italy also. This genre of horror film registers unconscious anxieties repression, fear, etc. You know, the genre of horror films registers in the unconscious realm of human minds or unconscious areas of the viewers or the audience. What? Anxieties, fears and repression. എന്താണ് ഒരുതരം ആധി, അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ഭയം, മാനസികമായൊരു സമ്മർദ്ദം, ഇതെല്ലാം സൃഷ്ടിക്കാൻ ഈ ഹൊറർ ഫിലിംസിന് കഴിയുന്നു എന്നുള്ളതാണ് ഹൊറർ ഫിലിംസിൻ്റെ ഒരു വിജയം എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. സോ see, these things are there in the horror films, and we can clarify these using psychoanalytic paradigms. Paradigms means paradigms examples. So human mind is very difficult to understand. In our unconscious realms there are fears, anxieties, etc. The horror films actually boost these feelings up. They accelerate the development of these feelings in our minds, and we can find out these feelings and emotions using psychoanalytic methods. That is something psychological. Then the Thing from Netherworld, which was released in 1951, and A Creature from the Black Lagoon, കറുത്ത തടാകത്തിലെ ജീവി, The Creature from the Black Lagoon, released in the year 1954, classified as horror and science fiction hybrids. It is a hybrid of, or these films are hybrids of science and horror, science fiction as well as horror. Horror genre and science genre are together mixed in these films, like The Thing from Netherworld and Creature from the Black Lagoon. These films represent the widespread fear of communism and nuclear war in the US during 1950s. Actually, the horror films represent, there were fears and anxieties in the minds of the people about the spread of communism. In the capitalist country, America, there was widespread fear in the minds of the people about the spread of communism and nuclear war. And actually these fears are represented in these horror films, or these horror films tried to accelerate, tried to bring out these suppressed emotions of fear that was there in the minds of the people. So these films represent the widespread fear of communism and nuclear war in the US during the 1950s. The crime horror film discusses the issues of politics and ideology. Actually, the crime films, or we can say crime horror films discuss the themes of politics and ideology. Then the splatter films, which shows the human body with all its vulgarities, degenerated forms, in the mutilated forms, the wounds and pus, these are showed in splatter films. The splatter films, or the body horror, it has another name which greatly exemplifies the film genre. The horror film is also called body horror. The splatter films, or the body horror, focuses on the human bodies that are subject to mutilation, the human bodies which are subjected to mutilation and decay and degeneration. That is what is being focused in the splatter films. Or we can say the splatter films focus on the human body which is subjected to mutilation, cutting into pieces, decay and degeneration. These are splatter films. Human bodies and mutilated human bodies are shown on the screen by using special effects, by using VFX and SFX. The Blob, a film, horror film. The Blob, a splatter film, which was released in 1958. Then Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, released in the year 1956. The Blob, released in 1958. And the Invasion of Body Snatchers, which came out in the year 1956. Night of the Living Dead, a great horror film, a typical horror film. The Night of the Living Dead, etc. fall in the category of splatter films. These are all, as I have just told you now, fall into the category of splatter films. As they depict on screen, these films depict on screen splattering large amount of blood, the oozing out of blood from human bodies, gore, and show disgusting bodily fluids. Disgusting bodily fluids. These films show horror films present unpleasant experiences on screen. Actually, every genre, every subgenre of horror films show, what do they show? The experiences of the unpleasant experiences on screen, which make the audience feel enjoyment while being frightened. That is a psychological reaction on watching the horror movies. We feel a kind of enjoyment. We feel a typical pleasure by being frightened. At the same time we are getting frightened, we feel a sense of wild pleasure also. That is what the horror films impart to our mind, our psyche. See, horror films present, what do they present? Unpleasant experiences on screen which make the audience feel enjoyment while being frightened. So that is a psychological strangeness that we all possess. Let Right One In. Let Right One In, a horror film which was released recently in 2008, 12 years back. The Twilight Saga. The Twilight Saga released also in the same year, 2008. And also the television series True Blood, 2008. See, these serials as well as the films like Let the Right One In and the Twilight Saga depict vampirism. Vampirism means what? Vampirism means the experience of the show of vampires. What do you mean by vampire? Vampire is the animated dead body. The animated dead body which wakes up in the night like Dracula and attack people and suck blood from them. So blood sucking monsters are, or blood sucking ghosts are vampires. Vampirism means the depiction of vampires is called vampirism. So the two films of vampirism are Let the Right One In and the Twilight Saga. They depict vampirism. Please remember this name, vampirism. The term vampirism should not be forgotten. The two German silent horror movies, Robert Wien's, a famous film I have earlier mentioned, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a horror film. Which was released earlier. It is a silent film which was released in 1919. The silent film was got released in 1919. And Frederick Mandero's Nosferatu, a symphony of terror. The title is much longer, Nosferatu, a symphony of terror, which got released in 1922. Another silent film. These are excerpted These films, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Nosferatu, A Symphony of Terror, these films have accepted. These films have produced considerable influence upon horror movies in Hollywood. These films have made great impact on the horror films in the Hollywood. The post-World War II horror movies can be classified into distinct categories which include the movies depicting the unnatural horror. After the Second World War, so many movies came out under the label of horror films and under the genre of horror films which can be classified into very clear categories. The post-World War second horror movies can be classified into distinct categories which include the movies depicting the unnatural horror. Unnatural horror means showing the vampires, ghosts, demonology, means showing demons, witchcraft will be there, like our Malayalam movies Kaliga and Vayanadan Thamban, two old films. Witchcraft is there. Witchcraft, body horror will be there, and this is one of the category. And another category is psychological horror. The example is Peeping Tom. I have mentioned in my earlier class. Peeping Tom, directed by Michael Powell in the year 1959, and Psycho, 1960 film. Psycho and the Massacre of the Texas Chainsaw. The Massacre movies title is The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It is a massacre movie which depicts a large scale of killing, large scale of murder of people. And Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which was directed by Tobe Hooper in 1974. It is a film depicting the horror of massacre. These are the horror films. Let's have a quick look at fantasy films. We are going to have a panoramic view of fantasy films. Any fiction that deviates from picturing the real or natural, any fiction, novel or story that deviates from that, takes its path from, deviates from picturing or showing or depicting the real and natural, and tends to explore the realms of the impossible, and which tends to explore the realms, areas of the impossible or the magical, can be considered as fantasy. What is fantasy? Any fiction that deviates from picturing the real or natural and tends to explore the realms of the impossible or the magical can be considered as fantasy. The relevance of the theme or plot, the relevance or the importance or significance or the theme or the plot of these types of films is only secondary importance. The theme of plot has only a secondary importance. രണ്ടാമത്തെ പരിഗണന മാത്രമേ ഉള്ളൂ പ്ലോട്ടിനും തീമിനും ഒക്കെ, വെൻ കമ്പയർഡ് ടു ദി വിഷ്വൽ എലിമെൻറ്റ്സ് പ്രസൻറ്റ് ത്രൂ ഇറ്റ്. വിഷ്വൽ എലിമെൻറ്റ്സിനാണ് പ്രാധാന്യം. ദി റെലവൻസ് or the importance or the significance of the theme or plot of these subtypes of films is only of secondary importance, secondary value when compared to the visual elements presented through it. Animation, modeling, special effects, etc. contribute to the delineation of impossible worlds. The delineation or picturing clearly of the impossible worlds, അസാധ്യമായ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ സങ്കല്പത്തിൽ മാത്രമുള്ള ലോകങ്ങളുടെ ചിത്രീകരണത്തെ സഹായിക്കുന്ന പ്രക്രിയ അനിമേഷൻ, മോഡലിംഗ്, artificial setting, and special effects, computer generated effects. Special effects contribute immensely to the delineation or the clear picturization of the impossible worlds. The fantasy films are generally classified as horror. Fantasy films are also classified as horror films, science fiction, fairy tale, and adventure movies. Fantasy films are classified as horror, science fiction, fairy tale, and adventure movies. The origin of this genre can be traced back to the trick films of early 900s. 1900-ൽ അതിൻ്റെ ആരംഭ 20ാം നൂറ്റാണ്ടിൻ്റെ ആരംഭകാലത്തുണ്ടായിരുന്ന ചില ട്രിക്ക് ഫിലിംസ് ഉണ്ട്. ട്രിക്ക് ഫിലിംസ് ചില ട്രിക്സ് ഉപയോഗിച്ച് കാണിക്കുന്ന അതുപോലെ ഫ്രഞ്ച് ഫിലിം, ഈ ട്രിപ്പ് ടു ദി മൂൺ പോലുള്ള സിനിമകൾ, അതൊക്കെയാണ് ഈ ഫാൻറ്റസി ഫിലിംസിൻ്റെ തുടക്കമായി നമുക്ക് പരിഗണിക്കാൻ കഴിയുന്നത്. The origin of the genre can be traced back to the trick films of early 90s, such as A Trip to the Moon, which was the silent movie came out. Silent movie was released. It came out. The movie came out in the year 1903. The director was the famous French filmmaker Georges Méliès. A Trip to the Moon. A clipping of this film was available in our early videos. And fairy tales like Beauty and the Beast, Jean Cocteau's film. Jean Cocteau, who produced this film in the year 1946, The Beauty and the Beast. That is also a fantasy film. And Disney animation films, Walt Disney's animation films like Snow White and Seven Dwarfs. The earlier film, the other day's class I mentioned, Snow White and Snow White and Dwarfs, directed by David Hand in 1937. Then Pan's Labyrinth, and the heroic fantasy film The Thief of Baghdad. Thief of Baghdad. In Tamil also the film was there, Baghdadile Thirudan. The Thief of Baghdad. It is a fantasy film. It is of course fantasy, a mythical film. The Thief of Baghdad, directed by Raoul Walsh in the year 1924. So these are the later examples of this genre. Fantasy films include the earlier types of fantasy films were A Trip to the Moon and Beauty and the Beast and Snow White and Dwarfs, and later came Pan's Labyrinth, The Thief of Baghdad in 1924. And these are the examples. The impact of computer graphics imagery, CGI, computer graphics imagery, CGI, to create special effects has brought about the spreading of these genres. So the spreading of this genre of fantasy films was accelerated by the special effects, CGI, computer generated graphics. In Malayalam there was a film, it was a kind of horror film with the fantasy, Adishayan. It was a computer generated film, and so many films are there. So many films are there in Hollywood films, computer generated fantasy films. Avatar. Also, when we examine the fantasy films, we can see some serial films. The films which have made frequently. The first one is the Star Wars series, Harry Potter films, and Lord of the Rings trilogy. So there are three films, three versions of the Lord of Rings. So Lord of Rings trilogy generally fit into the category of fantasy. All these serials or series of films, the Star Wars series, Harry Potter films, there are 6 series altogether now, by the story by J.K. Rowling. And there are many directors are many. The first two films of Harry Potter series were directed by the same director, but later films were directed by some other directors. So the Star Wars series, Harry Potter films and Lord of the Rings trilogy generally fit into the category of fantasy. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. The first series was Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by Chris Columbus. The filmmaker was Chris Columbus, which came out in the year 2001. And the Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, second series. And the stories by J.K. Rowling. Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets came out in the year 2002. And Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, which came out in the year 2004. The director was not Chris Columbus. The director was Alfonso Cuarón. Alfonso Cuarón was the director. In all, there are 6 series have actually come out till now. Then Lord of the Rings, the director the filmmaker is Peter Jackson. Then the trilogy are The Fellowship of the Ring. The first film was The Fellowship of the Ring. Second one, The Two Towers. Third series was The Return of the King. The Lord of the Rings series were The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, The Return of the King. The fantasy delves deep into the realms of our unconscious and the world of our dreams. Fantasy actually stirs the world of our dreams. നമ്മുടെ മനസ്സിലെ ആ സ്വപ്നങ്ങളുടെ ലോകം, അതുപോലെ തന്നെ നമ്മുടെ അൺകോൺഷ്യസ് റിലംസ്, അതിനെ ഇങ്ങനെ ഇളക്കി മറിക്കുകയാണ് ഈ ഫാൻറ്റസി ചെയ്യുന്നത്. അവിടേക്കാണ് ഫാൻറ്റസി സ്വാധീനിക്കുന്നത്. ഫാൻറ്റസി ഡെൽവ്സ് ഡീപ്പ് ഇൻ ടു ദ റിലംസ് ഓഫ് അവർ അൺകോൺഷ്യസ് ആൻഡ് ദി വേൾഡ് ഓഫ് അവർ ഡ്രീംസ്. Heterosexuality and family rather than sexual identity constitute the great subject of mainstream Hollywood cinema. Hollywood ഫാൻറ്റസിയുടെ കാര്യം പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഹെട്രോസെക്ഷുവാലിറ്റി തീം, അതുപോലെ ഫാമിലി തീമൊക്കെയാണ്. അല്ല സെക്ഷുവൽ ഐഡൻറ്റിറ്റി മീൻസ് ഐഡൻറ്റിഫൈയിങ് എ സിംഗിൾ പേഴ്സൺ ആസ് അവർ സെക്ഷുവൽ പാർട്ട്ണർ ഓർ ലവ്. അങ്ങനെയൊന്നുമില്ല. ഹെട്രോജീനിയസ് സെക്ഷുവൽ ആക്ടിവിറ്റീസ്, ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് heterosexuality is presented in Hollywood films. And family rather than sexual identity constitutes the great subject of mainstream Hollywood cinema. Fantasy expresses dominant ideology and social myths. Fantasy films actually express dominant ideology and social myths. The drastic fate meted out means given. Meet out means give. The drastic fate meted out to the victims in the fatal attraction. So in the film Fatal Attraction and Psycho, what happens? See, very drastic fate, the fate is very much expected. Anyhow, the horrible fate is meted out given to the victims. The films are Fatal Attraction. The film was by Adrian Lyne in the year 1987, and Psycho. They substantiates the realization of these dreams. These films express the realization, they show the realization of the dreams which are there in the realms of our mind. In the drastic fate, a married liar gets into an extramarital affair with his colleague Alex, the girl Alex. And Alex gets very much distressed with the affair, and the woman Alex tries to sabotage his married life. അയാളുടെ മാരീഡ് ലൈഫ് തകർക്കാൻ വേണ്ടി ശ്രമിക്കുന്നു. മലയാളത്തിൽ ഇങ്ങനെയുള്ള ഫിലിംസ്, അക്ഷരത്തെറ്റ് പോലുള്ള സിനിമകൾ, അതുപോലെ മോഹൻലാലിൻ്റെ ഒരു ഫിലിമൊക്കെ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു ഇങ്ങനെ തകർക്കാൻ ശ്രമിക്കുന്ന. മമത മോഹൻദാസ് അഭിനയിച്ചൊരു ഫിലിം ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. So these are fantasy films. Today we could only do two genres of films: horror films and fantasy films. Horror films and fantasy films. Study these genres quite well and be prepared for writing any kind of answer.